thanks for coming and spending some time with us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start things off with one of your calling cards in the race is being the outsider, the non-Washington person. Mm-hmm. So you've indicated perhaps that the way to fix our Washington dysfunction is to have somebody from outside Washington come in and offer some fresh perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I'm struck that seems to be what we did 4 years ago, mm-hmm. Which not everybody thinks is going well. So how would that be different in your case?
Yeah, so I think there's a difference between electing a public servant from middle America and electing a disgraced reality TV show host, for sure. There's more than one way to go outside of Washington. What I'm talking about is the idea that the kind of government experience and leadership we need is the kind that you get on the ground working as a mayor of a city of any size, but especially in a strong mayor system like we have in Indiana. And I would argue especially from a city that is not one of the biggest cities in America. In other words, we've got a president who pretends to speak for communities like mine, lower income, industrial, working class communities. And it's time for a voice that actually comes from the experience of shaping and guiding one of those communities to be in Washington. I think the public service is important. I think, for that matter, military service is important. Not that it's a prerequisite, but that it can't hurt. And I think that from the perspective of certainly beating this president, it would be a good idea to have somebody who has those traits, because every time my party has won, every single time, we've done it in the last 50 years, certain things have been true about the candidate. The candidate's been new on the national scene and had not run for president before. Either did not work in Washington or hadn't for very long. Was running a values-based campaign that called the country to higher values, and represented a newer generation of leadership. You add to that the fact that Americans almost always choose, in terms of style, the opposite of whatever we've just had in the Oval Office. And I think I have something to offer in that regard. And that speaks to the part about winning, but also the part about governing, where I think we need more of the mentality of a mayor who's accountable for getting things done, for results, for bringing people together, and get that into Washington before it's too late.
Well, there's still, at the federal level, and you look at the way the transition played out with the Trump administration, I guess post Chris Christie's, when, a lot of the issues started to come up, that there's something to be said about having a working knowledge of the federal apparatus, particularly with some departments that, aren't even fully replenished 3 years in. So what do you say to folks who are like, hey, look at my record in the Senate, look at my record through all these years of actually working with and understanding these agencies, where do you think you fit in there?
Well, it's certainly the case that members of Congress will be more familiar with the federal bureaucracy. On the other hand, depending on their background before, they may be less familiar with executive leadership. It's, of course, at a different scale, but I've run a transition and built an administration. And I think when you're a senator, depending on your background, of course, it's possible to be a very senior senator in this country and have never in your life managed more than 50 or 100 people. My experience is that of having to not only formulate good policy, the way that a legislator would be expected to do, but also design and lead an administration, the way an executive would be expected to do. And on top of that, and what's different from some executive jobs too, is when you're a mayor, you're responsible for guiding a population and calling that population to its highest values. I know that's not documented or written as part of the job, the way the policy functions and the executive responsibilities are. I would argue that's actually the part of presidential leadership that we are most severely seeing the cost of its absence right now in the current White House. I acknowledge there is no job like the presidency. There's no job remotely like the presidency, and it's a leap for anybody. But I'd also argue there's no job quite like mayor, and within the kinds of jobs you get in government, it is unique for understanding some of what's at stake.
Yeah. So, looking at maybe a less than ideal scenario, if Mitch McConnell is still the majority leader of the Senate, and everybody who comes in here says, we're going to have this huge movement, we're going to win. But considering that hypothetical, how would you try to get some of your initiatives through Congress, and what are some things that a President Buttigieg could do, whether it's with executive orders or other things, irrespective of any congressional gridlock?
Yeah. So, like others you may have spoken to, I definitely don't want to accept that that's our fate. But we have to prepare for that. And the good news is that even more than what was available to President Obama 10 years ago, we have a healthy American majority ready to go on the things that I'm talking about. Whether it's areas the Democrats have been trusted on for a long time, healthcare, raising wages, other economic issues, or whether it's on areas where my party's been on defense in the past. Thinking about immigration, guns for sure, where now a vast majority of gun owners and Republicans agree that we ought to at least be doing things like background checks. There is a level of popular support for the things we're proposing to do, even in conservative states, which means that there is an opportunity, if it's not effective to work on some of the politicians in Washington, to work around them and to go to those that they are accountable to and compel them to explain, the senators in particular, to explain to their voters why they're defying them. Because that's what they're doing when they resist these initiatives. This is not to say that it'll be easy, but we've already seen evidence of how this can happen. A good example would be the fact that even when everything was in Republican hands, and when the central commitment of the entire Republican Party was to repeal the Affordable Care Act, when it came time for a vote on the floor in a Republican Senate, they couldn't pull the trigger. Why is that? Because the American people didn't want that. And while they have been spectacularly unresponsive to the will of the American people overall, it reveals that there is a backstop in terms of what voters will put up with.
And are you in favor of repealing the filibuster or trying to get things through, budget reconciliation and things like that?
I do think the filibuster needs to go for no less a Senate institution than Harry Reid to come out and say it's got to go tells you something. It's always had a mixed history. It was there originally intended as a fairly extreme backstop, and when it was used, a lot of times it was for fairly dark purposes, like frustrating civil rights legislation. And we've reached a point now where functionally nothing gets to move with fewer than 60 votes in an institution that's already one of the less democratic bodies we have, just because of its structure and the math. So I do think it's time for the filibuster to go, and then we'll be a little less dependent on things like reconciliation.
All right.
So let's talk a little bit about policies and funding and taxes and all of those fun things that you get to wallow in all the time. You're no different than other candidates in that you have some big changes you'd like to affect. Some of those are costly changes, and we have a deficit of over $23 trillion right now. How important is it to lower that deficit, and how would you do that?
I think it's very important. I know it's not always been fashionable in my party to talk about the debt and the deficit, but you may have noticed I'm more inclined to get into it than others in my party. First of all, because the Republican Party has demonstrated that when they actually take power, they don't care. We have $1 trillion deficit. As you said, the debt's approaching $23 trillion. And the very same voices that would invoke the deficit to block any proposal to make an investment in health or education or infrastructure have revealed that they're not actually going to do much about it, which means it falls to my party, as it often has. After all, every Democratic president of my lifetime has seen a reduction in the deficit, and I think the reverse is the case for every Republican president in my lifetime. But I think we should also not hesitate to discuss and own the issue for several reasons. One of them is that debt service has now reached the level that it really is threatening to crowd out other priorities. Just the amount we're spending on an annual basis just servicing the debt. Two is that maybe it's a generational outlook. I think I might be here when some of these things catch up to us. I think this is becoming a question of generational justice. Third, because deficit spending is especially important as a tool for dealing with a recession, the bigger the deficit now, the less headroom we have in the event of another recession, which is going to happen sooner or later. So for all of those reasons, I think it's very important to put together a vision that's going to lead to the deficit shrinking. And that's what the sum total of all my plans would do. So look at my cost side and then look at my revenue side. On the cost side, it's one of the reasons I'm being careful what we promise. So I believe in universal health care, but it's important to me to generate a way to do it that was 1.5 trillion instead of 20, 30, or 40, depending whose argument you're listening to. On college, I was careful in terms of what I proposed. Still a very generous and high impact proposal, but one of the reasons I'm asking top earners, kids, to pay their own tuition is so that we're able to program those dollars for other things. So we're keeping costs under control, but there's a very real price tag to the things I'm proposing we do on everything from education to housing to health. So that brings me to revenue. We can raise the revenue to do all of this without going to some Eisenhower level of taxation. Not even close. I mean, we're talking about keeping it within or below tax levels that in American history, in recent American history, have been compatible with very strong growth. But we do have to have the courage to do it. What does that look like? Looks like a higher marginal rate on top earners in income tax. It means capital gains tax reform so that we no longer send the message that that we somehow want to tax work more than we tax wealth. I think that involves rolling back the Trump tax cuts. I'm especially thinking about corporate tax cuts, which led to this phenomenon of some of the most profitable corporations in America right now, earning billions of dollars and paying less in taxes than you and I did last year, specifically zero or sometimes negative tax rates. It means closing a lot of these loopholes that sound very technical, but the 199A alone is a mechanism that, if we trued it up, would probably be worth hundreds of billions of dollars over the years. It means better enforcement of what we've got. That alone could also generate a lot of revenue, just more effectively enforcing revenue collection with corporate players in particular. If we were willing to make these moves, and I'm proposing that we do, then the sum total of everything that I've offered in this campaign, in terms of costs and revenue, will be to reduce the deficit, and at worst will not cause the deficit to grow.
And are you looking at specific new sources of revenue for some of these plans?
Well, most of it's built into the tax policy changes I've talked about, but not all of it. So, for example, for that 1.5 trillion that my healthcare vision would cost over a decade, about 1.4 of it you could get off of that Trump corporate tax rate cut reversal. But there's another big amount of money on the table that is being left just by the failure to have a policy that lets Medicare negotiate drug prices. It's a no-brainer. Everybody thinks we ought to do it, and we don't. If we do it, CBO thinks that's $300 to $400 billion over a decade. So that's part of how we get the rest of, actually that's all of how we get the rest of what I would say on healthcare. That's an example. Another example is on rural broadband. So we estimate that to get everybody covered, either by fiber or by wireless, we're looking at about $80 billion. Some of that we just have to be willing to invest, but 40, so half of it, could be raised just by auctioning some of the C-band spectrum the government already controls. So yes, we can be creative with other revenue sources, but at the end of the day, we have to be willing to ask corporations and the wealthy to pay their fair share in taxes.
So, I mean, so why not a wealth tax then, in the sense that there are all these assets that are sitting around and, you know, they're not passing through as anybody's income, and some of your competitors have argued that that would be a great way, one, to secure a bunch of revenue without having to affect anyone other than like 70,000 Americans, and that two, it would also have some effect in curbing income inequality. So why have you been against that idea?
Well, I'm not against it. I think it makes sense for all of those reasons. What I would say, though, is that it's also more vulnerable to being challenged.
So yours are a safer bet, you think, than a wealth tax?
Right. So what I would say is that a wealth tax could make sense. But in the early years, I would program it for things like deficit reduction rather than have my signature programs depend on the wealth tax. Because we would want to see it survive those constitutional challenges before we lean on it as a core source of revenue for our most important. Because imagine a scenario where we establish something like some of the healthcare proposals that have been put forward. Then 2 years into it, the wealth tax is successfully challenged on constitutional grounds. What is the plan B? I'd rather have a plan A of a solid set of, which again has the same effect of taxing those who are wealthiest, and not have so much depending on the newer tax that we're introducing until we make sure that we understand how it's going to work, how it's implemented, and whether it can withstand those legal challenges.
Yeah. So you kind of already answered our question on how to pay for the healthcare plan. Do you want to go to the...
No, actually, I want to get back to the cost of that. So you're setting your Medicare for all who can, for all who want it.
Right.
Cost, the public cost you're setting at 1.4 trillion.
1.5 we estimate for a decade.
Okay. So the recent number I saw for 2018 alone, the Affordable Care Act costs half that. So what is different about your plan that it's not going to cost 5 times that?
So
what's the basis for your cost projections?
So that incremental cost largely has to do with making sure that it's affordable to everybody. One of the things we're proposing, for example, is to set up the premium structure so that it's never more than 8.5% of your income. We got to make sure that everybody can afford this coverage. An out-of-pocket cost that is set monthly, not yearly. Because you see all these situations where people are... It happened to a friend of mine recently. You're delaying a medical procedure or hoping that something will happen in a certain month because your out-of-pocket cap is yearly, right? We don't experience the economy yearly. Most of us don't. It's bi-weekly or it's monthly. That's when our paychecks and our bills come in. So we set it up that way. So these are some of the factors that create the cost. And it's real. And it's why we're making that clear. In addition to the broader challenge in making sure that we're just a healthy country, right? I mean, a lot of the things that will affect health outcomes in the long run are around expenditures on mental health, research, food policy. Food doesn't get talked about nearly enough, considering that it's as big a driver of your health as anything that'll happen to you in the doctor's office or anything else covered by health insurance.
Do you think that there's a place for the federal government to say you eat this, not that?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that a lot of this is not that people haven't been told what to do by the federal government. It's the limits on options that people have. So many people, especially in lower income areas, sometimes in rural areas, sometimes in cities, live in food deserts where it is a lot easier to get an orange pop and a bag of Cheetos than it is to get decent, healthy food. And it's part of why we've got to be intentional about things like that, just access to safe and healthy food, in addition to all the things we're doing on the clinical side.
And how do you approach whether some real opponents of Medicare for All argue that by having particularly the really high risk pool populations in the same system, that's kind of the key, and that was the thinking honestly behind the individual mandate, was that that would help get costs down. Are you worried that the government option could just be more susceptible to having a lot of those folks who need long-term care and the really expensive kinds of healthcare that would perhaps make the balance between it and the private option unsteady? I'm just curious what you make of that compared to having no private insurance.
So anytime you set up a new insurance pool, you got to think about the risk management. And there are precedents for doing this, both in the U.S. and in other countries that have done it. And I think we can manage that. Part of what I do call for is retroactive enrollment of anybody who's uninsured. The idea is that there's no such thing as an uninsured American. And it follows on the philosophy of the mandate and how important that is, because otherwise you get a free rider problem. But I think that's manageable, and you add to that the economies of scale and the purchasing power of a national program. You add the better outcomes that'll come from ensuring that nobody's uninsured, which means more preventative care. You add to that the no-brainer moves like Medicare being able to negotiate. And I think the real question is whether the private plans will be able to compete. If they can't, then people will organically move to Medicare for All. And if they somehow do, so much the better. The important thing to me is not seeing to it that the government's your healthcare insurer. It's making sure that everybody's covered well one way or the other.
Would your approach require people to get insurance?
In effect, it's a little different from what we're used to in terms of mandate because it's the retroactive enrollment, but functionally, yes.
That there would be no penalty for that? It would just be de facto they have it because they got signed up for it.
Yeah, the penalty, so to speak, would be that you bought it. But you get insurance, so it's not just you're getting dinged.
So, but you have to justify it on a tax basis, if I understand the court ruling on this.
There are some policy design challenges to make sure that it withstands legal scrutiny, but we're pretty confident that it will.
So, since we're on the topic of health, one of the big health concerns here, and in a number of other areas around the country, is drugs and the opioid crisis. So everybody we talk to, everyone we've talked to at every level of government for the past 5 years who's come and sat at this table said we need to address this, we need to put money toward this. So money is going toward it. Is it being used the way it ought to be? How do you think we need to address getting past that situation? What's the priority?
Yeah, so I take this very personally. It's touched my community as well. People I know, people I went to school with that we've lost to the opioid crisis. And then in addition to people we've lost to overdoses, we had a pain doc who was killed basically by a patient, by a family that was just literally losing their minds in the course of this addiction. And it's touched so many people, and is happening to communities around the country. Money's necessary, for sure. We've got to fund solutions. It's not enough. We've got to look at several things that are beyond just what we fund. One of them is sending the signal that we support medication-assisted treatment. We still have these caps on what a provider can subscribe. I visited one needle exchange clinic in an area of southern Indiana where my mother's from, where we now have a secondary black market just for things like Suboxone, because those are so restricted. We need to make sure we're lifting caps that aren't necessary. We need to make sure there's a message going from the White House on down that we understand this is a medical, not moral failure. And do those at the same times that we're doing things like holding the companies accountable for their malfeasance, which I think is part of how we get the funding to deal with this. At home in South Bend, we're doing peer recovery coaches, because sometimes what will happen is somebody gets brought back from the brink with Narcan. They wake up in a hospital, and their life depends on whether they survive 3 weeks, 5 weeks before somebody can see them. Or our de facto recovery facilities are just the jails. It makes no sense. It's no way to handle addiction treatment. And so part of what we do is we make sure that there are peer recovery coaches who've been through recovery who kind of hold your hand through that period. And I think that's a very promising model we should build out. There's a prior question too, right? Which is, why are so many people self-medicating to begin with? And I think in rural areas, but also in more industrial communities like mine, we got to pay attention to that. It's one of the reasons why part of my plan on mental health and addiction is funding for what we call healing and belonging grants, basically helping communities address ways to create the sense of belonging that people need. And if they're missing it, especially if they've been through an economic shock, a change in where they fit in the economy that doesn't just threaten their income, but it threatens their sense of purpose and identity. If we're not dealing with that, there are a lot of other things ready to rush in, from white nationalist identity politics to opioids. And so ensuring that we're supporting anything that can build up a sense of community and a sense of belonging, and then tying that back to the health picture, I think is really needed, big picture, before we even get to the point where we're trying to support those who are in recovery or who we're trying to help into recovery.
One of the things that's tied to that, that is tied to opioids in that sense, is mental illness.
Yep.
And your health plan talks about addressing that. But can you get a little bit into how you think that needs to be addressed specifically?
Well, the first thing we know is we need more providers. It's clear that we have a provider shortage everywhere, from the VA to rural communities to schools. And we need to make sure, through everything from reimbursement rates to recruiting efforts to support for professional development, that we're building up a new generation of mental health professionals. There's also a cultural piece where we've got to make it as permissible and commonplace to talk about a mental health challenge as you would talk about a physical health challenge. We don't think twice about discussing an upcoming knee surgery or a battle with cancer even. But if we're talking about a battle with bipolar disease or an addiction challenge, it's less likely to be talked about. One of the things I've started doing sometimes at a town hall is just ask for show of hands on how many people have been impacted, either that they or someone they love or someone they work with has been affected by serious mental illness or addiction. Almost every hand goes up. We got to change our willingness to talk about these things and destigmatize it so that people actually know that they can be supported. Then there's this middle layer, right, between just a culture that deals with mental health and the fact that we need a place for people to go when they're willing to acknowledge or when somebody's identified that they need help. And that middle layer now is doing all the work. I'm thinking about teachers, I'm thinking about police officers, which are often the closest thing somebody will get to a mental health professional or an intervention. Teachers are on the front lines of mental health, and they're not getting the mental health first aid training that they need. We've got to make sure that we're putting resources into that, and making sure that once their first aid training has helped them identify the difference between a routine discipline issue and a healthcare issue, that they actually have somewhere to refer you to. Otherwise, they're still not getting the resources they really need to address the problem. So this is everything from culture to clinical and in between. And we got to have a level of intention and a level of funding to make sure we're rising to deal with that.
We were talking with Senator Sanders about this. What do you do about therapists and psychiatrists who right now don't take Medicaid, Medicare, and often they don't even take private insurance? It's just an out-of-pocket compensation. Would that still be possible under your plan, or how do you tackle that?
Well, it's another example. When you have a shortage, the first question I always ask is, what are we paying? And part of what we got to do is true up the reimbursements so that there wouldn't be as many reasons for that. In addition to generating more people in the field, we got to make sure that we're funding it accordingly. Otherwise, sure, we have rules on the books that say there's got to be parity for an insurance provider. You got to cover mental as well as physical. But if you can't find somebody, or if the wait list is so long for somebody who will actually take your insurance, your Medicare or Medicaid, then it's not really parity, is it? So to me, the best way to solve that is to make sure that we're investing accurately.
Yeah.
So a lot of this comes to the Medicaid program, which is sort of federal-state partnership kind of thing. So would your approach be to implement this all at the federal level, or is it a carrot and stick thing with the states, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, I like to say state-federal partnership, but carrot and stick would be another way to put it. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we know that we can set standards, baselines, frameworks at the federal level that can flow through. It's also part of what's behind this idea of the healing and belonging grants. And you'll see this as a pattern across a lot of my initiatives, and it's kind of the mayor's eye view, that the answers don't all have to come from Washington, but more of the funding should. And we need to support local solutions that help identify the particular issues, because whether we're talking about addiction or mental health, it varies. For example, in my community, one of the things that happened is we were doing more work on opioids. There's a lot of African American voices saying, that's great that you're talking about opioids, but we've got kids also with a problem with this synthetic marijuana, which is not, you'd be way better off with real marijuana. It's basically poison sprayed onto some kind of grass. The kids were buying at gas stations, and I personally wound up encountering kids overdosing on this stuff, and it was horrifying. That may not be an issue in another state. And so we've got to make sure that we're supporting local solutions. In our Douglas plan for dealing with racial health inequities, part of what's in there is the idea of health equity zones that support locally crafted solutions, but do it with federal dollars. Because I think we need to recognize there are a lot of good problem solvers at the local level trying to get this done, but they're doing it without nearly enough resources. Then you got county health departments, sometimes heroically keeping up with flu shots and restaurant inspections at best, that should be empowered to be chief health strategists for their area. And that's part of what's in our public health equity plan, is to really support capacity building in those local and county efforts.
So to get to a place where you would want to, you'd implement the Douglas plan, obviously you need to get through the primary, and one of the, I think, well-documented challenges your campaigns face at this point is a challenge winning over support on particularly older African Americans. Right now, Joe Biden is doing very strong in that respect. But You've had a couple, listening sessions. There was the article that was written about you where you called up the author and had a chat. I'm wondering, what other things do you think are left that you need to do to be able to do that? I know your campaign says you're introducing yourself to the community, but now we're in January of 2020. So what else needs to be done?
Well, for a lot of black voters, there's a sense that they always share with me when we're reaching out of being not only abused by the Republican Party, but sometimes taken for granted by my party. And when there's been that experience or that feeling, longevity pays off. There's certainly value in having been present for years or decades so that folks really know you. I'm coming at it from a different place, of course, as a new figure on the national scene. Something I think is an asset, but does mean we have to work harder to create that kind of trust. And I welcome that challenge. One of the things that I think has been valuable in addition to making sure that we have offered the most comprehensive plan and vision, which I believe the Douglas Plan to be, on dealing with racial inequality, and the kinds of different campaign styles that you mentioned. In other words, especially in the South, the value of having conversations, maybe 30 people at a time instead of 1,000 people at a time, so that I'm listening as much as sharing. Another thing that's proven more and more important is to elevate South Bend voices. So the majority of black elected officials who know me best, in other words, in my community, the majority of those who've endorsed anyone in this race are supporting me. And it's important for people to hear about why. It's not because they think I'm perfect or that we conquered racism or poverty in our city. It's that we made real progress on everything from poverty to unemployment in ways that outstrip the national pace for dealing with these things, that we rolled up our sleeves and worked side by side, especially in response to issues like police shootings. But not only as reaction, but getting ahead of things. That created that sense of goodwill and good faith. And it's one thing for me to say it, and it's another for somebody from the community to say it. And so part of our approach in the closing weeks, and as we build to the closing argument, we need to make sure that those voices are empowered as well.
Yeah, and taking a longer view, I mean, now that we're in a new decade, I feel like it'd be safe to say that a lot of Americans thought that as we entered the 20-teens, we had our first black president. There was kind of a sense that either, we were on the cusp of entering perhaps a post-racial era. Some people, even openly said they thought that was the case upon Obama's election. And I think at now we're going to the 2020s, polling shows that Americans think racial tensions are worse. When you talk about the overall, our overall life expectancy as a country, I mean, just one group, middle-aged white men have kind of almost single-handedly brought that down because of suicides. Across the board, what do you think you can do with the bully pulpit and with policy to try to bridge a divide that perhaps has gotten worse?
Yeah. Well, the first is to face the fact that these demons of racial, not just racism, but racial inequality and a racialized life have never left us. And I think most black folks you'll talk to are not as surprised as a lot of white folks by what this decade has shown us. And that does mean making sure that there are voices to, frankly, compel white America to think a little more about race. Part of being white is not being reminded of race in the way that you are if you're not white. But this can't just be something that is only discussed by candidates of color or with voters of color. This is a national problem. It is undermining and eroding our national security. Russia identified racial division as a way to harm and destabilize us. And most, I think visibly, it's harming people whose interests are the same. I talked to, when we were at Reverend Barber's church in North Carolina, talked to a mother who described losing her son in a way that you can pretty much directly say was a consequence of the refusal to expand Medicaid, which in turn, you could certainly argue convincingly, was a result of racial voter suppression changing some election outcomes in North Carolina. Now that family was white, but it cost them just as much to be part of those patterns of racial, or part of a state that is living with these racial patterns of exclusion. No one suffers more than those who are discriminated against directly. But my point is, the whole country suffers. Everybody suffers. And people with common interests are being pitted against each other. So what do we do about it? It's as your question suggests, it's a matter of the bully pulpit as well as policy. The Douglas Plan is all about concrete policy measures we need to undertake that are restorative, that are urgently needed, that are not just the right thing to do, but are going to make the country stronger. It's also just having a president who will surface these issues and give America a framework other than defensiveness or guilt or anger to deal with these things that have never left us and in many ways define the American experience for a lot of Americans.
So let's move it a little bit into some nuts and bolts policy stuff.
Mm.
So our country long ago spent an incredible amount of money to build roads and bridges and airports and all kinds of great infrastructure that opened up interstate commerce and had all these fantastic benefits. And now it's starting to age and deteriorate, and we need a big bump in infrastructure projects spending. What would your priorities be for infrastructure, and how do we go about getting it done?
Well, there's no question that we'll need federal funding to get there. I will admit this is one of a tiny handful of Trump campaign promises I thought might actually be kept because it was widely popular. Both parties wanted to see it happen. You talked about it a lot, and communities across the country would have embraced it, and it would have goosed the economy in a way that might have been good politically for the administration. And yet, when they came out with their vaunted plan, their plan was basically for local and state government to do most of the work, which is how it works right now. And so it wasn't exactly a game changer. We are going to need to not just update and replace infrastructure that is crumbling, but look at new forms of infrastructure. I consider digital and broadband access to be a form of infrastructure today. And again, with a mayor's eye view, I think about things that maybe don't get as much discussion, although they're starting to, which is what's underground. Well, the nature of providing clean, safe drinking water is you never have to think about it. The moment you do, you're not free to think about much else, as the people of Flint were so painfully reminded of. And it's not the only place where water infrastructure is failing Americans. So whether it's water, wastewater, roads, digital infrastructure, also the kind of infrastructure we're going to need to meet any of our climate goals. We have got to actually build not just vehicles or widgets, but a country that is ready for a different climate future. And that means on everything from rail to electrical grid, that we're ready to make those investments. And yes, it's a commitment of federal dollars that will have to be in the hundreds of billions. But unlike, for example, income tax cuts on the top brackets, these are investments that have proven to pay for themselves over time. And we can expect that they will.
How car-centric would your infrastructure plan be? I mean, I'm not just saying autonomous cars are here right away, but we spend a lot of space on parking lots in this country, and it's very central to our lives. And as much as people talk about high-speed rail or intercity tramways, it seems like just as a cultural component, we like to stick with what we've got. So how do you think about that long term with your climate goals?
I think cars are always going to be important. Part of it's just making sure the emissions associated with cars fall eventually to zero. And we can do that. My plan calls for us to get there first with light vehicles and then eventually with heavy surface vehicle transportation for the simple reason that we have to. And we're not that far off from being able to do it. I mean, we do it now, but cost effectively do it when it comes to cars. That being said, we should also prepare ourselves to be a little less car dependent. That means investing in transit in ways that break this idea that only those who lack alternatives would use transit, which I think is the attitude, especially in more smaller communities. If you're in a big city, it can be very routine for anybody from any walk of life to take the subway because it's the quickest way to get somewhere, take the bus. That's not the perception that you have in communities like ours, I think. And partly we can invest in ways that change that. It's also how we build our communities, how we build our cities, because we make choices all the time about something as simple as how our communities are laid out. Again, it's my mayor's eye view, but it really matters whether federal policy recognizes this. These choices may serve to either subsidize or punish anything from walking to biking to driving. And we can arrange ourselves as we build communities for the next 100 years in more efficient ways.
Yeah.
That also, by the way, are often better socially. There's a
Right.
lot of
Right.
good work on how social infrastructure, just whether your towns and cities are built up in a way that people run into each other. And encounter each other.
Cul-de-sacs and
Yeah, I mean, the rate of survivability in tornadoes, according to our Red Cross director in my state, is different based on whether the neighborhood, even holding everything else equally, whether the neighborhood is set up in a way where neighbors talk to each other, like whether the garages are set up that way or not. It just makes you more resilient, and resilience is something we got to think a lot about going into a 21st century that's going to be shaped, no matter how hard we work at and succeed at climate change, is going to be characterized by more frequent and extreme weather events.
Yeah. So on climate change, I mean the biggest beneficiaries of anything you would want to do as president may not even have been born yet, but for the folks who are around for it, you've talked about having a kind of dividend plan. I'm wondering if you could flesh out what that looks like, just from the perspective of what Americans can expect to have to sacrifice, what kind of skin in the game the public is going to have.
Yeah. So the dividend idea is to offset the carbon tax, because we're going to have to do carbon pricing in order for our economy to just accurately reflect the true cost of the things that we do every day. Mm-hmm. And I don't think this is money that should be sucked out of the economy. I think that we should make people whole, make people more than whole, by a rebate that'll be on a progressive basis. So that's what I'm thinking about when I talk about the dividend. But from a Treasury perspective, it should be neutral. But there are other things that we can look to that are going to help more people gain who are not sure there's a place for them in the future. I'm thinking about industrial workers where I live, and I think around here too, who maybe feel like they're just being beaten over the head, told they're part of the problem, where actually we can't solve this without them. And it's not just folks working on really cutting-edge, high-speed solar technology. I'm thinking about union insulators and glaziers and electrical workers that we're going to need a lot more of, just in order to get our buildings ready for the energy profile they need for the future. We've got to make this a national mobilization, that everybody sees where they fit. Part of my national service plan is a climate corps, because I'm thinking about someone who raised her hand at a town hall recently who felt just overwhelmed and distressed about climate change. Her big question was, how can I help? What can I do? Where do I fit? And I want to tell her not to see this through the framework of guilt, but to feel empowered that she's part of the solution. And that's part of what these kinds of service opportunities can create. The message to workers has to be that among the 3 million net new jobs that we estimate we're going to create between now and 2050 by rising to the climate challenge, that we need you, especially if you're in one of these areas, from manufacturing to agriculture, that has historically been treated as part of the problem, but really has to be part of the solution for us to get there.
So moving from the domestic side to internationally, I know that you and pretty much every other candidate in this primary has called for rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, but one would imagine that inevitably there will be some developing country or some country will realize that if everyone's going to buy into the same international standards, there might be an opportunity to be like the concrete manufacturing capital of the world or something. So, how do you deal with the long-standing issues of developing countries that have not gotten in to enjoy the same, progress we have with fossil fuels, but also any kind of other scenarios like that?
Well, it's one of the reasons why our approach to trade, which in my view should be neither trade war nor free trade, has to contemplate this. This is why things like a border adjustment tax are important. We can't have somebody free riding on exploiting international environmental standards. We do need to show regard for the fact that some countries got to go through their growth before there were these kinds of agreements around climate, and the best international agreements and frameworks contemplate that. Joining Paris, I think, is table stakes. What we've got to do is lead the world in doing something about this, and that means that diplomacy has to be part of the picture. In other words, there has to be such a thing as global climate diplomacy. And if the U.S. is leading on this, it's a good moment for us to be recovering our endangered credibility around the world. In other words, America's at its best when it's leading in a major international struggle of purpose, whether it's however imperfect we've been along the way. Whether you're thinking about the Cold War, or World War II, or the establishment of the United Nations post World War II, we're at our best when we're a force for good and for global cooperation to deal with big problems. Our reputation has taken a beating for doing those things. One of those big problems is climate, and we should be at the forefront of dealing with it. We're going to have to, because we're only a fifth of the emissions anyway. This doesn't work unless we're bringing the world with us. But it also doesn't work without us. And in order for us to be able to lead globally, you got to be doing the right thing here at home. And by the way, if we're also leading the climate race, that's a benefit for us competitively. I want American agriculture techniques to pioneer the revolution in soil management that'll help take carbon out of the air, the same way that the Green Revolution that started in the American Midwest helped prevent famine in countries around the world. We should be proud of this. And we'll only succeed if this becomes such a national project that the way most people feel about climate is not guilt but pride. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to be paralyzed. And all these neat ideas that every politician comes up with will just be in the committee room.
So one of the perhaps perceived disadvantages of not having been part of the Washington establishment might be in foreign relations. You served in the military abroad, thank you, and but you don't have that kind of experience of matters of state. Given the perspective that you do have, the United States has mucked about in a number of countries' business throughout its history, and right now we have troops abroad in several places. Some people would say we shouldn't. Under what circumstances, other than directly defending our nation, would you send troops elsewhere?
Well, you're right. My perspective on foreign policy starts with the fact that American foreign policy sent me to war, and that my friends are, as we speak, at the tip of the spear of American foreign policy. And so it's very personal to me that we make these decisions right, and I won't ever be underestimating the gravity of decisions that are made in the Situation Room. What does that look like from a use of force perspective? One of the reasons I thought it was important to lay out a worldview, and I think I may have been the first candidate to do a full foreign policy address in the spring, is to establish my sense of what America's role in the world is, which has a lot to do with leading with our values. And it has a lot to do with American interests. Now, I think our values and our interests can't be separated. Every time our country's tried to separate the two, it's caught up to us. That said, there have to be core life and death interests at stake in order for us to consider the use of force. It should be a last resort. It should be connected to a need to prevent a direct threat to the American people or American interests, or something that is happening to our treaty allies that requires, as part of international coordinated and legitimate action, that we step up. And again, when there's no real peaceful alternative. The bar should be a lot higher, in other words, than it is now. The time has come to repeal and replace the authorization that was passed after 9/11 that has troops everywhere from Afghanistan to parts of Africa, even though it was officially for dealing with Al-Qaeda. And one reason I believe that any future request for an authorization for force ought to have a 3-year sunset, and if necessary, would have to be renewed by Congress, is that I think the American people have fallen out of these debates, have not been invited into these conversations, and through Congress need to be present for these discussions. Congress needs to be willing to take tough up or down votes on whether to deploy troops into a conflict area, and a president needs to be able to make the case to Congress why there is no alternative. Otherwise, we shouldn't even be there. I thought I was one of the last troops leaving Afghanistan. I thought I was turning out the lights. That was years ago, and we're still there. And what that tells us is we need a much clearer sense of a connection between the mission, the people of the country, and the people who are out there on behalf of the country, and raise the bar in terms of clarity and in terms of what it would take for us to contemplate a deployment.
So how would a security force in Afghanistan? You talked in that speech about having, instead of these kind of mass surges, you would just have small, intelligence-based counterterrorism efforts with a minimal number of troops there. Would they fall under that 3-year reauthorization, or is that a separate thing?
Well, there's always going to be a need to deploy certain intelligence assets around the world. That's different from things that we talk about when we're contemplating a war powers resolution. I would say that the medium term in Afghanistan probably looks a lot like what the president just dismantled in northern Syria. In other words, we end the commitment of ground troops, but we have a specific specialized special operations, counterterrorism, and intelligence presence that could, in the case of northern Syria, could be measured in the dozens in some areas, but was enough. Not to turn Syria into Switzerland, but to prevent the worst outcomes. And for all the political objectives we have in Afghanistan, some of which we need to really demonstrate a commitment to upholding, like the advancements toward democracy and in the status of women there, our military objective is to ensure that that's never again used as a base for an attack on the American homeland. It's a limited objective. That means a limited commitment in terms of ground troops.
Troops out, and after years and years of conflict in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq. But if your intelligence indicates that, or even common sense indicates that if we do that, we're going to leave those countries in worse shape than when we entered them. Do you still make that call and say, yes, but these are our troops and we want to...
Well, that's where the international community comes in. That's less of a puzzle when we're not alone. And I think America, the so-called America First policy, really amounts to America alone. It sets us up as one more country out there scrapping for advantage instead of as a global leader. The things we're talking about in terms of the conditions on the ground, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or any of a number of other places, are not only in the local interest and the American interest. There is a human and global interest in better outcomes there. And that's where, onto our specific military objectives, we can layer an international and geopolitical commitment, working with our partners, working with our allies, and working with resources beyond military resources in our toolkit, diplomatic, economic, technological, to promote good outcomes. We cannot accept the responsibility for other countries being stable, prosperous, and peaceful, but we can certainly do our part to make them more so, whether it's in a case that that we understand very well, like Afghanistan, or an area that's impacting us differently, like Central America, or conditions in the Central American triangle countries that are not unrelated to past American foreign policy are leading to a migration crisis that's actually catching up to us.
What are your thoughts on defense spending as a ratio of our national budget?
I think when you talk about it in terms of numbers, it can get arbitrary with these kind of across-the-board ideas of how much higher or lower should it be. But when we talk about it in terms of where the spending is going, I see a lot of reasons to believe it can be reprioritized and that we'll find savings when we do. A simple example is the fact that we are investing very little in artificial intelligence compared to rivals like China, even as we invest a lot in certain kinds of conventional assets. If we lose things like an artificial intelligence superiority, our most expensive ships and bases are more likely to become very expensive targets. And so we've got to reprioritize where our spending is going toward 21st century priorities. We have a president with a 17th century imagination when it comes to security technology. That's what a big wall and a moat full of alligators is. That's a 17th century solution. And we need to have a 21st century approach. As we do, I think we'll also identify areas where we can be more productive, more efficient, and more tax effective than we've been. Like anybody who's served has seen ways that money can get burned up pretty quickly. in the military. And we also need to look at our contracting structures, where we have sometimes cost-plus contracts with very little accountability, and ensure that they are actually leading to results, and that they're set up in a way that is conducive to a good return for the taxpayer. And I don't think that's happening all the time now.
While we're on this, maybe we could pivot to a question on trade, but I mean, China is probably under-discussed given the likelihood of it being a continually forefront issue for whoever the next president is. I was just curious what your thoughts on their kind of increasing influence on other countries is as we've withdrawn on the international stage, whether it's the One Belt, One Road, or building islands in the South China Sea. There's news this week about a military base in Djibouti that is like suddenly swarming with Chinese troops. So what do you do when a lot of countries that may have wanted to side with us before are suddenly with them?
Well, it's one example of how much is at stake in the soft power competition. So when China's investing potentially more money in foreign countries' infrastructure than we're investing federally in our own, they're not doing it to be nice. They're doing it to open up new markets and to extend their influence. And we should recognize that our retreat is coming at a cost. And we certainly see, especially at a moment like this, where the American model is starting to look chaotic and risky and even weak, that the Chinese model is going to be held up as an alternative. Now, to me, the Chinese model amounts to the use of technology for the perfection of dictatorship. That's what we're seeing over there. And I think the world has an interest in American rather than Chinese leadership on some of these issues. It doesn't mean that we have to be on a collision course with them. It does mean that we need to be upfront about our national security interests, that we apply those national security interests in our trading relationships, especially around economic arrangements pertaining to electronics, also pharmaceutical inputs, and other areas where we got to disentangle. But we're also looking at a lot of opportunity to figure out frameworks that will lead to stability. And their overall priority, I think, in the Pacific Rim is stability, which is not detached from our goal.
Do you think the TPP, is that a good start to accomplish that? Would you want a plan like that to be implemented?
The intent to make sure that some of these trade rules were being written on America's terms rather than China, I think, is certainly something that we should look to. The deal itself, I think, was problematic in the way that a lot of recent trade deals have been. Whereas if you look at the improvements that were made, especially after the democratic negotiating intervention in USMCA, we can see what it looks like to build, even that's imperfect, but seeing what it's like to build more meaningful enforceability and labor provisions into a trade deal is a good example of what we need to do looking forward. We can't put a wall around the status quo. We can't withdraw from the world and expect good things to happen for the United States. We have to engage, and that engagement can take a lot of forms. But it also has to rest on some level of American moral authority. We should have the courage of our conviction on things like democracy and human rights. It should not be possible to purchase the silence of America's president on something like the democracy protests in Hong Kong or the internment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, just because there's a trade negotiation going on. Those folks need to at least hear that they have some measure of moral support from America, even if we are limited in what we can do internally in another country.
I want to talk about election security in a moment, as you were talking about China's abilities technologically, and certainly they're not the only foreign nation that might pose a threat. But first, you mentioned a couple moments ago having a 17th century outlook militarily. Space Force? Come on.
So, here's the thing about Space Force.
Oh, I should have done this.
If you look at, it's really rearranging some things under a new banner. We're not talking about anything like the resources associated with opening a new branch of the military, which in a way is a relief, because I think that sends a message. First of all, it would be spectacularly expensive, and secondly, it sends a message about the militarization of space that I think is the wrong direction for us to go in. Now, we have a lot of national security equities in space. We got to stay on top of that. I felt that the Air Force had a pretty good handle on that in terms of the way the command was structured. They want to move it around. I think that's mostly cosmetic. I do believe in space exploration, by the way, as both an intrinsic good and a way to drive innovation and growth in our country. But I'm skeptical that the Space Force concept is very meaningful operationally.
Okay, I just want to throw that out. So talk about election security.
So there are different levels where we've got to improve our democracy in order to have it be worthy of the name. And part of it is that we have a lot of vulnerabilities. It's why we need paper trails on our ballot mechanisms. We also have to undertake much deeper reforms for our elections to be what they ought to be. We see voter suppression, from suppression of the student vote in New Hampshire to the native vote in North Dakota to the black vote in Georgia. We see, if you just stop and think about it, it's at least peculiar. I mean, put it this way, if you were on an election observer mission in Afghanistan and saw that people competing in elections were also responsible for running the elections, you would flag that as a concern. We're used to it in the United States. It's just what we do. And there have been many times, like the election in Georgia, where there's a lot of concern about the actions of a candidate who was also the Secretary of State at the time, running the election, in which there were a lot of problems. And so it's not just a matter, of course we need to secure the technologies that are present at polling locations, but also let's look at how our elections are run, and let's look at how our elections are structured. Here we are rightly making sure that we prevent elections from interference on the day of, and not nearly paying enough attention to elections where the district boundaries are drawn in a way to decide the outcome of the election before the first vote is even cast. That's a problem. It's a really big problem if we want to have confidence in our elections. And if we're trying to get to the bottom of why turnout is lower than it is in a lot of democracies, we should look at those issues, as well as issues like the things that make it harder for a voter to vote, from ID laws to the simple fact that Election Day is not a holiday in the United States, and the hurdles we create around registration, all of which are actionable, and much of which was part of H.R. 1, one of many good policies to come out of the House and die in Mitch McConnell's Senate. And among those policies also were measures that would secure our elections and polling places for the future.
I was curious, what do you do about gerrymandering when the Supreme Court has basically said, this is not our problem? Who's going to handle that? I mean, from a federal perspective, like, what can you really do?
Well, I think what we can do from the federal level is, first of all, lay out standards for what fair districts look like. And there can be flexibility in how you meet those standards, but we should establish what those standards amount to. I mean, a lot of gerrymandering is something that is pretty blatant. It doesn't take a big debate to see when it's happening. But also we can show what fair districts look like, because some states have undertaken those reforms and been very effective in them. I don't think we can count on the courts to sort this out for us, especially after the Supreme Court acted the way it did. But also we can't take it sitting down. And we should also look at in the context of the 21st Century Voting Rights Act, which is mostly needed to make sure that these forms of voter suppression can't carry the day. We should also take as much as we can by way of what's respectful of federalism but responsible for federal leadership, and bring that to bear on things like districting reform.
We got a couple topics left. I know none of them fit well into
That's okay. I do want to ask one thing, though. So 4 years from now, you're either stepping down or running for re-election. What do you want people to say about you and what you accomplished? What's the one thing that you want to say in 4 years from now, we did this?
I would want it to be said of my time in office that America came to feel like one country with a common purpose. And a good measure of that would be for those who disagreed with my party and did not vote for me, to look at the presidency and the White House on my watch and feel that it belonged to them, even if they had a different political or ideological view. What we have to do is set up a future where, for the majority who are ready to take these policy steps, and it is a majority on issue after issue after issue, that we are delivering real momentum, that the biggest issues of our time, from climate change to gun violence to racial and economic inequality, are visibly getting action and moving toward a better place. But through it all, for not just the maybe 60% who believe in most of these things I'm talking about policy-wise, but for the 100% of Americans whose lives depend on the judgment of the American president, that they can look at the White House and sense that the White House is a reminder that they belong in this country, that we have moved in the direction of an American experience that's about belonging and not about exclusion. I know that sounds less concrete than most of the things we've been talking about, but I think that's the real measure of success, because if we build that, a lot of the other things get better. Just as at home, I was very mindful of and very focused on concrete things that we could change, from investment levels in low-income neighborhoods to what was going on with the jobless rate and so on, and very data-oriented and inclined to measure every success and every shortcoming. But as I was reflecting yesterday in my last moments as mayor, the real thing that's going to have mattered, that it was me and not somebody else leading our city in that time, that I'm proudest of, that we did together, is that our city believes in itself. Our city has given itself permission to believe in its future in a way that I don't think was true at the beginning of this decade, when they were writing about us as a dying community. In a similar way, all of the concrete things that we talk about and focus on in my white papers and in my campaign, what they amount to, if we get it right, is the sense of a country that knows where it's headed and that belongs to all of us. Something much harder to measure, but that makes everything else easier if we can deliver it.
Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.